Tihe Māori ora, e nei mana, e nei reo, e ro rangatira mā, he te mana whenua, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Ko waio, ko matātua te waka, ko tūroa te rangatira, ko tūhoi te iwi, ko Ngāti Kaura te hapu, ko Utunuku te marae, ko Tracy McIntosh ahau. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. So it's wonderful to be here. I bring greetings from my people to your people. I particularly acknowledge those that have mana whenua in this land, to the indigenous people of Tahiti, to the Tahitians. Tēnā koutou katoa. I also spoke to where I'm from, so I come from Tūhoi. We'll look at that in very, very quickly. So that is iwi, a tribe in the central North Island, and my marae is Otanuku, and my name's Tracy McIntosh. Just to give you a little bit of a sense of what I'm going to do, I'd like to apologise in the beginning. I'm going to be doing much more breadth than depth. And so I recognise that it'll be going across a range of things. Coming as I am so late in the conference, I thought it was important to make connections with some of the work that we've already heard today and to make those connections. So again, it does mean it's a very broad overview rather than a close overview. My own work is mostly within prisons, and I've been working. So as I said, my work is mainly in prisons, and it has been for well over a decade. That work very much takes the women and the men that I work with as experts of their own condition. That our research must be led by those who have lived experience, if we are to create positive, long-term, sustained, transformative change. So I recognise that the voices, the expertise, and the knowledge of those women, particularly wahine Māori, our Māori women, come into this room. When I talk of the particular women that I work with in the prison system, are usually very young, but they have all been sentenced to very long sentences. In quite a number of cases to life sentences for murder. And so I work with women a cohort of women who are experts around violence as well, both in terms of the social harm they have suffered and the particular conditions that led to the reasons of their arrest. Some of those young women were 14, 15 and 16 years old when they committed the offences that have led to them being in prison. Most of them have been in prison now around 10 years. And for some of them, they will be there for at least another 10 years. So I recognise them. The men I work with are mostly gang-associated whānau, so gang families. And I will speak very, very briefly about that. But just to recognise that with our prison statistics, where we have a gross disproportionality of Māori within our prison, very significant numbers of both our men and women are gang-associated whānau. That means they come from families that are gang-associated. The other side of my work is very much like Iha Aloha in the policy space. So we believe that all research must be transformative in intent and that it must work at this translational interface to create those positions of change. So just very briefly, and sort of looking at some of the things I hope very quickly to address, is particularly the issue of whānau violence in Aotearoa And we have to recognise this as a project of liberation and as an emancipatory project. It is also incredibly significant to recognise this as a decolonising project, that the issue of decolonisation is absolutely central for the well-being of our people and indeed the well-being of the broader nation. So that decolonising project is a very significant area. The notion around the restoration of mana, the restoration of the dignity and of the authority and of the autonomy of people, again works at the individual, but particularly at the collective sense. And in a colonial and neo-colonial environment, that restoration of mana speaks to for our non-Māori people as well. It has to be consistent with Tiriti o Waitangi. So the Treaty of Waitangi, signed in 1840, often seen now, not previously, as our founding document between Māori and the state, what we often call Māori and the Crown. So it's really important in regards to the simplicity of Tiriti o Waitangi to recognise the 3 articles in that treaty, the ramifications and the importance in terms of our partnership for that. And that last, these must be consistent with tino rangatiratanga, self-determination and our sovereignty. So these are very significant within the context of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And the last aspect, which has been much more a contemporary issue, is around mana oriti, around different ways of expressing our equal partnership between Māori and non-Māori within our setting. I'm going to go much, much quicker now. So here I'm just giving you, looking at New Zealand, but particularly in terms of what our iwi setup looked like. So if you look at our iwi, mine is this nice green one that you see there on the east coast. I don't have a pointer, centre of the universe. You can see that there's a huge amount of iwi in the North Island, and less down the South Island, though the iwi there, Ngāi Tahu, is very significant in terms of its material knowledge and its transfer of particular types of knowledge. So this is really one of those areas, I think, that we get the significant level of connection around what are the forms of violence that are present in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And this is not an exhaustive link. You know, there are far more than this. But certainly for us to understand violence in all of its different forms, we must understand state violence. We must understand the violence of the colonial project and the neo-colonial project. We must understand, I'm not going to mention all of these, legislative violence, the way that policy and law have created the conditions for violence, in many ways have enacted violence straight on people, and I will give you some examples of this. Political violence, economic violence, the significance, as we heard from Richard, that in many cases the economic violence is the heart of so much violence. The loss, the alienation of our land, of our resources, of our language, of our culture, was not just that we are a mytho-poetic people that have a special connection with our land, which was then lost through the alienation of our land, but our land was also our economic base. The removal of that land from the very earliest times removed our economic base, and it is very significant. I am going to speak also around institutional violence and the cultural violence that has occurred within many of our institutions, and the broader collective violence. Structural violence, I'm a professor of Indigenous studies, but I'm a sociologist by training, and so structural violence again is very much at the heart. Power and the way that power is expressed, the way that power is exercised, is very important. And so I have put them in these two sort of columns in regards to just how significant these are as drivers to these very significant harms and forms of suffering that we see on the other side. Here we really see, if you want to see what state violence looks like, what the violence of the colonial project looks like, this is just one way that you can look at it. Here we see through the confiscation and legislation that removed the rights of Māori to their own land. And so if we look at these confiscations, the furthest map shows in 1860, 20 years after the treaty was signed. Then we have the 1890s, 1910, 1939, 2000. That's the level and extent just in the North Island of what those confiscations and land were taking. And it was taken by raupatu. It was taken by force. Let's be very clear. Particularly in the first lots of lands where we saw raupatu. If I did one of these in 2004, I'd actually take even more land. We thought this was the last land grab, but we saw in 2004 with the passing of the legislation around our seashore and seabed, foreshore and seabed legislation that they were still willing to take more. So here I'll just go very, very quickly through in regards to what does that violence look like, that state violence, the colonial and the neo-colonial projects. So we see here Parihaka, 1881, a group known for its non-violence. In fact, many of its founders that we see down at the bottom, Te Whiti and Tohu Kahu, had a complete non-violence, non-resistant form of activity. Whenever the colonial troops came in and destroyed their lands, destroyed their crops, as we heard, destroyed their cattle, they started again. They were finally removed and taken down south. I mean, I'd love to talk more about Parihaka, and it is just a fascinating one. And for those of you who are interested, there is certainly a lot of material around Parihaka, and we have a National Peace Day every year now in terms of Parihaka. This one's very close to my heart because this happened to my people, Te Ngāi Tūhoi, which is our mountain of Mangapohatu. And so in 1916, our prophet, Ruakanana, was removed by force, as were his followers, and the community that he had formed was destroyed. We just had the final apology for this and the return of some of the flags only 2 years ago. Takaparawa. Those of you who have been to Auckland might know this as Bastion Point, right on the waterfront in Auckland. So here I'm just trying to show that this is not just the time of the colonial project, but it's a time of the contemporary issues as well. And so Bastion Point, we occupied, this is the land of Ngāti Whātua, Kita Aorake. So they had an occupation of their land for 506 days. And in New Zealand, it was the biggest use of military force outside of wartime to remove the people from their own land. And they did win this land back in the court. There's a real other sort of pain and suffering, a mamai, a pain that comes from this, is that Ngāti Whātua was the iwi, the tribe, that gifted their land so that Auckland could be established. And in the end, they were left with less than 1 hectare of land. Ruatoki, again, in my area, what has been referred to as the Tūhoi raids of 2007, under the newly established legislation of the Terrorism Suppression Act that was largely put into place to be used from the external enemy. The New Zealand government, like many other governments who have put this legislation in place, largely used it to try to control desistance. They tried to control those who were protesting. And so we had the Ruatoki Tūhoe raids on October 15th, 2007, where, amongst other things, apart from those who were arrested, young children going to their preschool were held in captivity with no access to water and food for the entire day. These were children under 5 years old who were going to their kohanga reo, who were going to their language nest. We've had an apology for that one as well. And right at the moment, we have this particular issue with Ihu Mātou. Again, for those who have gone to Auckland, this is right by the Auckland airport. And here what they're saying is we're not protesting, we are protecting. We are protecting our land from a legislative change of a historic, ancient land connected to people that the government wants to be used in one way. And I think it is really illustrative to look at against our people against the use of the orders of force in regards to the police. So in thinking about structural and coercive control, I'm really wanting us to really think about the connections between state violence and domestic violence. Because particularly if we look around that second one, I have to go a bit closer to it because of my eyes, state forms of coercive control often resemble violent relationships between intimate partners. So just thinking about this relationship between the state and a colonized people, and then thinking about that in regards to the way we often think about intimate partner violence. And we've actually heard a lot of this today. Because it involves some very similar things. It involves coercion. It involves detailed monitoring and surveillance. It involves denying resources. It involves blaming, threats, and intimidation. The victimization of whole groups, and the minimizing of very, very legitimate concerns. So drawing on the notion around structural violence, where we really look at the systemic frustration of aspirations, the systemic frustration of the aspirations of a people to flourish. We also saw this yesterday in terms of the cycle of violence, and again, just bringing this one to the attention of looking at how we can think about this within a state violence setting. That minimizing, denying, and blaming the victims, treaty claims, legitimate grievances denied, rendered invisible, using coercion and threats against the people, playing Māori off each other. We see this particularly in the treaty settlement process. Using children, lack of resources, blaming families, using Pākehā privilege, Pākehā values and institutions, and allowing Pākehā institutions, that is non-Māori New Zealanders, white New Zealanders, to make decisions for Māori. Using economic abuse, land theft, and the controlling of those resources. And as we've said, this land theft continues today. I also think it's a useful concept for us to draw on, Rob Nixon's concept of slow violence. I particularly use this in the prison environmental sense. So Rob Nixon is thinking about slow violence, particularly in regards to climate change and environmental degradation. That we can see the violence that is immediate to us, we recognize and understand as violence. But incremental violence, the slow violence of the alienation of people from their land, from their language, from themselves, that's the slow violence that you can see. prisons, and then particularly the increase in prison populations, can be seen as these forms of slow violence as well. And so I think it's a useful concept for us to think about in terms of some of the work that we're doing. Here I'm really just showing those sorts of legislative forms of violence. So if we look, I don't think you will be able to see it very quick, but I'll just look at one at the bottom, the Tōhanga Suppression Act of 1908. So the Tōhanga Suppression Act took away the right of Māori healers and Māori knowledge holders to ensure the well-being of their people. And so really significant in terms of the cultural and the form of ethnocide that such a legislation took place. You also have a legislation up there around the suppression of rebellion, for example, which again means that the right to defend your own lands from occupation were taken away from you. And this particularly impacted on some iwi, some tribes, very significantly. And the last one I want to, sort of period that I want to look at is around the mass institutionalization of children, particularly between the 1950s and the 1990s. 80% of these children by 1975 were Māori children. Many of these children were taken, and of course we do have the incredible similarities, though it was even more extensive that we've seen in Australia, but also in Canada and in the US in regards to the native residential schools. These children were taken mostly for care and protection, often because their families were seen as poor, and sometimes they were taken because of offending and petty offending. Too many of these children were subjected to what can only be seen by the United Nations definition, to torture, including, and I'm sorry Bertrand, electroconvulsive therapy that was used for behavioural change at Lake Alice. The average age of the child who was subjected to EGT was 11 years old. And be very clear, it wasn't used for therapeutic purposes. In fact, the memo that was sent out to the clinicians was that for children, they must be told it was a punishment. He truly believed he could scare those children straight. So this is a really, it's a criminal element. I won't read out this testimony, and I know that you'll be able to have access to these slides after. We whakapapata genealogy, and of course very, very significant to us as Māori, as it is for most people. Let's see. And so we at the moment have the Royal Commission into Historical Abuse, Interstate Care. Last week I gave evidence at that commission around, particularly drawing on the lived experience and the lived expertise of those that I worked with. The Royal Commission is likely to last around 3 years, and it is looking, it's covering the state of abuse through this very, very long period. So one of those things is really just trying to get that real strong sense around the implications on the violence that is currently in our communities to much broader, longer historical time frames that are that both are historic and are ongoing, and hence the incredible significance and importance of the decolonising element in our project. And this was a question that was asked, and I heard Kia Aloha speaking about it yesterday in terms of this sort of notion around what did our law look like. Every society regulates, every society has forms of social controls, every society has forms of social regulations. Māori society was no different to that. The notion around hara, which were first seen as infractions of tapu, but then were seen as much more broader types of things, needed to be dealt with in a very strong collective type of ways. Now, the types of remedies for these things can be a whole range of things, compensation, from engagement, from forms of apology, exile from one's iwi group, a very serious form of sanction and punishment, right to the possibility of a death penalty. Certainly most were dealt with in a much more broader range, and there I draw on Moana Jackson, our great legal philosopher and legal scholar in New Zealand. Again, for those who really want to know much more about this, he has written extremely extensively around those systems. So now I'll get to this part of the work and thinking, well, what does our contemporary situation look like in regards to whānau violence? And certainly what you see is that we are largely overrepresented, both as victims and as survivors of violence, and as perpetrators of violence. These things are often difficult to look at. We have extremely high levels of intermarriage in New Zealand. So, for example, you may have a Pākehā mother with Māori children. So those sorts of elements must be taken into it when we're talking about people suffering, particularly wahine Māori suffering from violence. And I heard a question of this yesterday. Their partners may be Māori, they may be Pākehā, they may be Samoan. Certainly the Native American research suggests to us, well, their particular situation is quite clear, that Native American women are at most danger, and they're in particular danger within their own community, at most danger when their partners are not Native American. There's some quite distinct elements within that, I think, for the Native American community, but we just do have to be recognised about how this is understood. So we have far higher levels of victimisation of all forms of crime, not just crimes of violence. In regards to, we can still see the 45% of unique offenders who perpetrated a serious crime against a family member were Māori offenders. So this is a real concern, and if we look down here, and I will speak about this a little bit more, is that it's probably our most well-known social fact in New Zealand is that we make up about 16% of the general population. We make up 51% of the prison population, and it is far worse for women. This one is, really important in terms of looking at the figures in terms of, well, what's the impact on our children? What's the broader types of issues? A lot of this will go to the Waitangi Tribunal next year, where the tribunal is meeting under urgencies because of the state's failure to protect our children, and in fact, children who go into state care, much more, their possibility of them being harmed actually increases. And when I think about all those young women that I see come into the prison, 83% of them, at the time of their arrest, the state was the parent. So it's very, very significant. But if we look at, in regards to right across, 37% of total children with sexual abuse findings are Māori, 46% of total children with physical abuse findings are Māori. The Women's Refuge, and just looking in terms of the Women's Refuge, and we do have Māori Women's refuge as well. But certainly we see, and there you really see 29% of women using the refuge are Māori, 39% of children using the refuge are Māori. So again, really significant in regards to those changes. An indictment of any country is certainly to look at child death statistics. And if we look at our child death statistics, remember we have a population of about 4.5 million people in New Zealand, 600,000 Māori, so another 140 in Australia, but 600,000 Māori living in New Zealand. So these are significant in terms of those deaths. It is very interesting in terms of media, forms of media representations. If you only looked at the media, you would think all child deaths in New Zealand were Māori. We largely do not hear about the non-Māori deaths. And we have to recognise that all of our children are valuable from wherever they sit, and this is our most sort of significant, one of our most significant issues. So now I'm really going to speak around the types of Māori responses and frameworks we have in place. So both in terms of mana wahine and in terms of mana tāne and in terms of mana tamariki, the mana of our men, the mana of our women and the mana of our children. Mana wahine, which is probably the most developed in the contemporary sense, also includes Māori forms of feminism within it, and is very powerful. And there's a huge amount of work being done on mana wahine. There's been a significant amount of calls to action. So in the last year, I've been involved in Te Wepu Hapai Te Ora. So that's a justice advisory group looking right across all of our criminal. We're an independent group appointed by the Minister of Justice to look at our entire criminal justice system and to create platforms of reform. And that's our first report, He Wakaroimata, a vessel of tears. And you also see the other one there, Inaya Tonu Nei. This one came out of our Māori Justice Hui, our Māori Justice Conference. Right now, the time is critical. We will lead as Māori, you will follow. So very strong in terms of that notion of mana oriti around really giving true expression to what partnership looks like. We've also seen just in the last few months the Hokai Rangi report come out from corrections. It is the first time that the prisons have created a Māori strategy that was Māori led. And it's quite an astonishing strategy, and Māori, you might be very interested in looking at this strategy. So I'm going, one of the things I guess that all I'm going to say here is that we have a criminal justice system that does not meet the needs of anyone. It does not meet the needs of victims or survivors, and it does not meet the needs of those who have perpetrated harm. It is what we do in New Zealand, I always say we don't have a justice system, we have a punishment system. And so the possibilities of healing and restoration are very limited within the system that we currently have. If we look at in terms of Māori and the figures there, again, it's a point that I've already made, that they are disadvantaged at every level of the system, and that institutionalised racism and systemic discrimination is rife. And the evidence is very clear. It's not like we're just thinking this is the case. We've been able to demonstrate that now for many, many years. Probably the first really important report in the contemporary sense was in 1988 with the report He Whaipanga Hou, and that has been demonstrated. And moreover, the discrimination increases at each step of the system. So by the time you get in front of the court, the chances of you being convicted as Māori become 7 times to 11 times more than any other group. So through every step of that system, even if we look in terms of these same types of offences through every step of that system, the discrimination increases. And so you'll see there that, 50% of the Māori population, of the male prison population is Māori, 63% of the women's prison population is Māori. If I looked at the ages of between 16 and 25, 92%. And we have a very high incarceration rate. The really importance that Ke Aloha talked about yesterday around disaggregating data. So we have an incarceration rate of around 214 per 100,000. But if we disaggregate that data, for Māori, it's 717. 717 per 100,000. So 717 per 100,000. For Pākehā, 90 per 100,000. That's the importance of disaggregating your data. Because if you're going to have an intensive intervention, you actually have to know what it is you're looking at. So the quality of your data is really important. And so these are really speaking around the particular calls to action. And I think that you can see within our calls of action the importance of recognising state violence, neo-colonial violence, legislative violence, institutional racism, and discrimination within our system. So we see that with the Anaia Tonu Nei report, and we see within the He Waka Roimata report, we see things again around what that colonisation and impact, that we say that, what we came across was a landscape of devastation. We travelled from the top of New Zealand to the bottom of New Zealand. We spoke to thousands of people. We ran hundreds of hui. And so these are the He Waka Roimata report really brings that together. We have another report coming out. It's already gone to government, but hasn't been publicly released yet. Will be released before the end of the year with our recommendations in regards to the transformation of our criminal justice system. I guess I'm just going to use that. The justice system has always been used as a blunt tool of colonisation. It has been used to harm whānau. So the sense around whānau we understand as an extended group. I saw it's not just the nuclear family, it's not just about who lives within a household, it's much broader than that, much more extensive. It talks to different forms of connections, usually kinship connections, but other forms as well. I was going to be talking to you about this, but I'm not going to. But it is a all of population study that we're doing at the moment on looking at violence, and we have interviewed 4,000 people with very in-depth interviews, and all of that was cold calling random interviews. We went to 10,000 houses to get 4,000 interviews. Half of those are men, half of those are women. And so we're getting those findings coming out. And largely we're hoping that this is really going to be used in the preventative space and around the possibilities of flourishing. It's interesting, my prison, the women who are in prison actually did the set of questions around flourishing, because I thought it was really important for them to be able to bring their knowledge and experience and understanding of violence to this particular piece of work, and it's largely been used at the policy interface. So we have a multi-government panel that we are working with in regards to this research. Etu whānau. So etu whānau, stand up whānau, rise up whānau, etu whānau. Etu whānau is a completely Māori-led, Māori-driven national initiative around strengthening families, strengthening connections, strengthening our men, our women, our children, through a whole range of quite localised initiatives. It is funded through the Ministry of Social Development. Very modest funding, but we're getting some very good results with our Etu Whānau report. And one of the things, and I've got all of the hyperlinks, so they've got a lot of resources in these hyperlinks. But this charter of commitment that all whānau and family and many gang-associated whānau have become involved with their tū whānau. In fact, most of the ones I work with are actually gang-associated whānau. And they find it is liberating. There is an emancipatory element within it because it recognises where they come from. They come to understand why they are where they are. It's a really important element about understanding why you are where you are. What are the historical and contemporary trajectories that gets you to where you are? There's a very high level of accountability, high levels of transparency, working with this. They do the strong whānau plans. Again, I can't give you any detail around this, but it is really important. We will support whānau to exercise rangatiratanga and autonomy over their lives. Again, the issue around self-determination, around our own leadership, is seen very significant. These are just some of the resources. There's a lot of resources available on that site. And like with Ke Aloha yesterday, you can sort of see these resources and you might be able to see how they fit your own circumstances, how they can be changed towards that. And the last bit I really want to talk about is the Kaupapa Māori research. So some of you will be familiar with Kaupapa Māori. Kaupapa Māori, again, is Māori-led research drawing on tikanga Māori, on our customs and on our values. It is both a philosophy and a methodology. There's quite a lot of debate actually around all of those things. And these two papers I think could be very useful for you. The basis for whānau violence prevention and intervention and the historical trauma and whānau violence. So Terry Dobbs and Moana Eroera and Leonie Pihama, Naropi Cameron and Rihi Tanana. So again, please have a look at these. They can be found on the New Zealand Family, the New Zealand Violence Family Clearinghouse. The New Zealand Violence Family Clearinghouse has many, many issue papers and resources. I sit on that board, and it's quite an amazing, freely accessible resource for you to draw on. And the last file there is particularly looking at the Family Violence Workforce Capacity Report. Again, an incredible report. We also have the Moriora framework, so very similar to our Hawaiian sisters and brothers. But really, when you look at this framework, just how important and how aligned we are in recognizing that our flourishing, our healing must come from within us. That we cannot, that mainstream violence prevention has not worked. They have failed. And please, I don't underestimate the profound nature of our challenges that we have, the complexities, the incredible intergenerational reach of our issues. But we know that the things that work, they work when we lead them, when we understand them, when we can specify and localize them to our community. I've done that one already, sorry. And again, I'm not going to go through these ones, and they're very similar. Most people will be familiar. There might be a difference in the way that we say them or the way that they're spelt, but particularly looking at what the framework, the working definitions, the significance of whakapapa, of our genealogy, of knowing our origins and when it came from. Those 100,000 children who were taken had their whakapapa disrupted. You never lose your whakapapa, but sometimes it has to be revealed to you. And in that revealing to you, we can sort of show where our strengths lie. And so you sort of see in terms of tikanga, in terms of mana, in terms of Māori. And so these issues around the context for violence, around historical factors, around whānau and family structures, and looking to fix the types of disconnects that we have in place. And I'm actually going to just leave that one with you as well. Amakura speaks, and actually it's got a really strong connection to these islands, because Amakura is both the leadership, but it is also the tropical feather. The tropical feather that the chiefs wore in their hair to show their status. And so Amakura speaks to those much longer associations. We are the Pōtiki of the Pacific. We are the last born of the Pacific. You are our tuakana. You are our elders. And our learnings together as tuakana and teina are still very significant to us. And I'm actually just going to... Here we can see the way that I love this one because it really speaks to the kia puawai of the blossoming of what we can do. So this comes out of our workforce capability and capacity building, the task force, and speaks to all of those domains, drawing on Māori concepts and very contemporary settings to ensure that we whakamana tangata, that we uplift the dignity of the people in our work. And the last thing I want to think about is towards transformative justice. What goes beyond our restorative justice work is the need for transformative justice, about rethinking Māori incarceration, rethinking responses to violence. In New Zealand, we use incarceration as a solution to social problems. It becomes a geographical solution to social problems, the containment of people. It doesn't create the conditions for healing. In fact, it's a maladaptive, anti-therapeutic environment. When people go into it, they will be released. And so transformative justice responds to the lack and the critical need for a liberatory, I've left a letter out there, decolonising approach to violence. So it seeks collective security, collective safety, high levels of accountability and transparency, and we see how this works through our E Tū Whānau program, and it moves towards habilitation rather than punishment as a solution to those types of issues. And in many ways goes right back to the sort of issues around state violence and the manifest authority of the state to determine our futures. Kia ora tātou katoa. Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou.